About 610,000 Americans were hired to build the atomic bomb. 2 of them died of the work itself. Everyone else died of the things that kill everybody: a bad heart, a stroke, 40 years of cigarettes. The 2 who died had names. Harry Daghlian was 24 years old. Louis Slotin was 35. They died 9 months apart in the same laboratory from the same lump of plutonium, and the second death happened because the first one changed almost nothing. The story you have been told is that the bomb killed the men who built it. The federal government keeps its own accounting of who got hurt building nuclear weapons, and that accounting now stands at $16.6 billion paid out. Almost none of that money went to a physicist. Here is who died of it, in the order it happened, and then who collected. There are about 15 names anyone can rattle off from the Manhattan Project: Oppenheimer, Fermi, Feynman, Teller, and a handful of others. That is the roster people mean. There were also several 100,000 other people, and this story belongs to them. Glenn Seaborg, who co-discovered plutonium, sits on no list of famous casualties because he lived to 86 and won a Nobel Prize. Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, and Niels Bohr all worked on it, and every one of them died of something unremarkable. The object at the center of both deaths was a sphere of plutonium about the size of a grapefruit. It weighed 6.2 kilograms, a shade under 14 pounds. It was machined as the core for a third atomic bomb. The one meant for Japan in late August 1945 if the war had continued. Japan surrendered, so the core stayed at Los Alamos, and the physicists started running experiments on it. The experiment was called a criticality test. You take a mass of plutonium that is not quite enough to sustain a chain reaction on its own, and you surround it with material that bounces escaping neutrons back into the metal. Push enough neutrons back in, and the mass starts to react, and pull the material away again, and it settles down. The job is to walk the sphere up to the edge of a chain reaction, hold it there long enough to read the instruments, and walk it back. Doing this by hand looks insane from here, and the reason it happened is that in 1945 the measurements mattered more than the men taking them. No one had built a remote rig because building one costs months, and the numbers coming off these tests fed directly into how much plutonium the next weapon would need. Get the figure wrong in one direction, and you waste material that costs 2 years and $2 billion to produce. Get it wrong in the other direction, and the weapon fails over a target. So a physicist put his hands next to the sphere and read the counters, because that was the fastest way to a number the program needed. Enrico Fermi, who had built the first reactor under a football stadium in Chicago in 1942, watched this being done by hand and said out loud that the men doing it would be dead within a year. He said that in 1946. He was describing the technique, and he was right about the timeline. On the night of the 21st of August, 1945, 15 days after Nagasaki, Harry Daghlian was in the laboratory alone. He was building a wall of tungsten carbide bricks around the plutonium sphere, one brick at a time, watching the neutron counters climb as each brick went into place. Every brick reflected more neutrons back into the core. The counters told him how close he was. He was moving a brick over the assembly when the counters spiked. He pulled his hand back to abort. The brick slipped out of his fingers and landed on the core. The sphere went critical. There was a flash of blue light in the room, which is what the air itself does when charged particles rip through it faster than light travels in that medium. Daghlian reached into the assembly with his bare right hand and pulled the brick off. That action stopped the reaction. It also put his hand directly into the neutron flux for the seconds it lasted. He knew what had happened. He walked out, reported it, and was in the hospital that night with his right hand already swelling. What acute radiation sickness does to a body is not mysterious, and by 1945 it was documented. A large enough dose in a short enough time kills the cells that divide fastest. That means the lining of the gut, the blood-forming marrow in the bones, and the skin. For a few days, the patient often feels better, which is the part that fooled people. The gut lining then fails, the marrow stops producing white cells, and the body has no defense against ordinary infection. Daghlian's right hand blistered and then died. The doctors recorded the progression day by day. He held on for 25 days and died on the 15th of September, 1945, of what the record calls acute radiation poisoning. He was 24. His mother was brought to Los Alamos to sit with him. The laboratory recorded his blood counts, his temperature, the condition of the tissue on his hand, and the daily progression of a death that no one at that point had much practice treating. The file on Harry Daghlian is one of the earliest detailed clinical records of acute radiation injury in an American hospital, and it exists because the man who generated it was one of their own and they had time to watch. The core that killed him stayed in service. That is the part worth sitting with. A man died touching that specific sphere of plutonium in a documented accident with a full medical record attached. The laboratory kept using it. There was no procedural change that removed the hand from the experiment, no remote rig, no requirement that a second person be present. The demonstrations continued in the same room with the same technique. The reason was momentum rather than carelessness. The war had ended, the laboratory was in the middle of preparing for the Bikini Atoll tests scheduled for the summer of 1946, and the criticality measurements were on the critical path for that work. Los Alamos in 1946 had a few thousand people in it and a schedule. A safety review that grounds an experiment costs weeks. No one had the authority or the appetite to spend those weeks. Los Alamos in the spring of 1946 was a strange place to work. The war was over, the mission that justified the secrecy had been accomplished, and a lot of the best people were already going home to universities. What stayed behind was a skeleton crew. A mesa full of temporary buildings that had been thrown up in 1943 and were already falling apart, and a weapons program that had become permanent while no one announced it. Men who had spent 3 years being told their work would end the war were now being told it would deter the next one. The urgency was still there. The reason for it had changed underneath them. Louis Slotin was the man who ran that particular test more than anyone else. He was a Canadian physicist from Winnipeg, 35 years old, and he had assembled the core for the Trinity test the previous July. He was good at it, which is a large part of the problem. He had done the operation dozens of times. The technique he used was slightly different from Daghlian's and considerably worse. Instead of stacking bricks, Slotin lowered a beryllium half-shell down over the plutonium sphere, letting the two halves of the shell approach each other. Beryllium reflects neutrons very efficiently. As the gap closed, the core climbed toward criticality. The two shells were kept apart by the blade of a flathead screwdriver, held in Slotin's hand, wedged into the gap. He controlled a nuclear chain reaction with hand pressure on a screwdriver. Fermi's warning, delivered a few months earlier, had been about exactly this. On May 21, 1946, Slotin ran the demonstration for 7 other men in the room. He was showing the technique to Alvin Graves, who was scheduled to take over the experiments. Graves stood at his shoulder, closest to the assembly after Slotin himself. The screwdriver slipped, the upper shell dropped onto the lower one, and the core went prompt critical. The room filled with blue light and a wave of heat. Several of the men reported tasting something metallic, like sour metal, at the back of the mouth, which is what a heavy dose of ionizing radiation does to the tissue in the sinuses and throat. Slotin threw the top shell off the assembly with his hand and ended the reaction in about half a second. The men in that room later calculated that if it had run for even a few seconds longer, more of them would have died. Then he did the thing that almost none of the retellings include. Slotin knew he was dead. He had absorbed a dose that made survival a mathematical impossibility, and he understood the numbers better than the doctors who would treat him. So on his way out of the building, he walked the room and marked on the blackboard exactly where every man had been standing at the moment of the flash, and how far each one had been from the assembly. Radiation dose falls off with distance in a way that can be calculated precisely. By fixing the geometry of the room while it was still fresh, Slotin gave the physicians a way to work out how much each man had received, which determined how each was treated. His last useful act was to convert his own accident into a usable data set for 7 other people. That blackboard sketch is the reason the medical response to the 1946 accident was as good as it was. Dose reconstruction is not guesswork when you have geometry. If you know a man stood 4 feet from the assembly and another stood 12, and you know the total energy released, the arithmetic gives you 2 very different numbers and 2 very different treatment plans. One man needs to be watched, another needs to be in a bed immediately. The 7 survivors were sorted on the strength of a diagram drawn by a man who understood he had about a week left. He died. 9 days later, on May 30th, 1946, he was 35. His decline followed the same documented course as Daghlian's, faster because the dose was larger. Alvin Graves, who had been standing closest, was hospitalized for weeks and survived. He went on to run the Los Alamos Weapons Test Division for years afterward. The other men in the room survived too, and some of them lived into old age. After Slotin, the hands came out. Los Alamos built remote-controlled machines to do criticality work, operated from a quarter-mile away behind shielding. The plutonium sphere itself was melted down that summer and recycled into the stockpile. The nickname it carries now, the Demon Core, was attached afterward by people telling the story. So that is 2 men. Now the other 13, in the order they died, because this is where the story people tell falls apart. Harry Daghlian died in 1945 of acute radiation at 24, and Louis Slotin died the same way in 1946 at 35. Then, the list changes character completely. Enrico Fermi died on the 28th of November, 1954 of stomach cancer at 53. He handled radioactive material for over a decade with minimal shielding, and it is reasonable to suspect a connection, but the medical record does not establish one, and honest reporting means saying that plainly. John von Neumann died on the 8th of February, 1957, at 53, of cancer. He is often listed as a radiation casualty. He was a mathematician who worked on implosion calculations, and attributing his cancer to radiation exposure is a guess that has been repeated until it sounds like a finding. Ernest Lawrence, who invented the cyclotron, died on the 27th of August, 1958, at 57, of complications following surgery for chronic ulcerative colitis. That is a bowel disease driven hard by stress. He worked himself past the point his body would tolerate. J. Robert Oppenheimer died on the 18th of February, 1967, at 62, of throat cancer. He smoked 4 to 5 packs of cigarettes a day for most of his adult life. The man who directed the atomic bomb project was killed by Chesterfields. Leslie Groves, the general who ran the entire project, died on the 13th of July, 1970, of a heart attack at 73. He is buried at Arlington. George Kistiakowsky, who designed the explosive lenses that made the plutonium bomb work, died on December 7, 1982, of cancer, at 82, after spending his later years arguing for arms control. Stanislaw Ulam, whose mathematics made the hydrogen bomb possible, died of heart failure on May 13, 1984, at 75 in Santa Fe, about 30 miles from the laboratory. Leona Woods, the only woman present at the first controlled chain reaction in Chicago, died on November 10, 1986, at 67. Klaus Fuchs, who passed the bomb's design to the Soviet Union and served 9 years of a 14-year sentence for it, died of natural causes on January 28, 1988, at 76. Richard Feynman died on February 15, 1988, at 69, of a rare abdominal cancer called liposarcoma. He also had a blood disorder called Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, which the retellings tend to describe as a second abdominal cancer. It is not one. Nicholas Metropolis died on October 17, 1999, at 84, of natural causes in Los Alamos. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, died of a stroke on September 9, 2003, at 95. Philip Morrison, who assembled the Trinity core with his own hands and stood a few miles from the first nuclear detonation in history, died in his sleep of respiratory failure on April 22, 2005. He was 89 years old, and he died in his own bed. So count that list one more time. 2 men died of the work. 13 died at 53, 53, 57, 62, 67, 69, 73, 75, 76, 82, 84, 89, and 95. That is a spread you would get from any group of men born around 1900 who did not go to war. That leaves an obvious question. If building the atomic bomb was not measurably dangerous to the famous physicists, why has the United States government paid out $16.6 billion in compensation to the people who built nuclear weapons? The answer is that you have been looking at the wrong list of names the entire time. The figure everyone repeats for the Manhattan Project workforce is around 130,000 people. That figure comes straight out of the records, and it measures something other than what people think. It is the peak head count, the most people on the payroll at any single moment, and that moment was June 1944, when the figure stood at 125,310. Peak headcount and total headcount are two different measurements. The project ran for roughly 4 years with brutal turnover. Construction crews who poured concrete at Oak Ridge and moved on, women hired out of high school to sit at Calutron control panels in 8-hour shifts, machinists, pipe fitters, truck drivers, laundry workers, guards. The declassified personnel records for the Manhattan Engineer District count the hires. And through the end of 1946, that count comes to roughly 610,000 people. Through the end of the war alone, it is somewhere near 485,000. Roughly 1 American in every 250 worked on the atomic bomb at some point during the Second World War. That scale had a shape on the ground. Oak Ridge went from farmland to a full-sized industrial city in under 2 years. It ate roughly 1/7 of all the electricity generated in the United States at its peak, drawn to run the machines that separated uranium. Hanford, in eastern Washington, ran 3 plutonium reactors on a stretch of desert the government had seized for the purpose. Turnover at both sites ran so high that recruiters kept continuous hiring campaigns going in a dozen states simply to hold the headcount level. Almost none of those people knew what they were making. The town they lived in appeared on no map and had no legal existence. Workers were told what to do and specifically not told why. A woman watching a dial for a full shift, told only to keep the needle between 2 marks, was enriching uranium and had no idea. That was the design. And this is the part where I would like to hear from you, because a fair number of you are 1 or 2 generations removed from this. If your father or your grandfather or your grandmother worked at Oak Ridge or Hanford or Los Alamos, I want to know what they told you about it and how much of it they were allowed to say. The comments on videos like this one always turn up people whose families were inside it, and those accounts are usually better than anything in the sources. The compensation program was written for those people rather than for the physicists. In 1990, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which covered uranium miners, millers, ore transporters, and civilians downwind of the Nevada test site. In 2000, it passed a much larger law, the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program Act, which covers workers at Department of Energy nuclear weapons facilities. Part B of that act pays a flat $150,000 plus medical costs to a worker with a qualifying illness, or to a survivor. Now the accounting, with the fence around it, because this number gets misquoted constantly. That program covers the entire nuclear weapons complex from 1942 to the present day, not the Manhattan Project alone. Within that scope, it has paid $11,575 million in compensation, plus $5,064 million in medical bills. $16,639 million total. 312,000 claims filed from 124,000 individual workers. The illnesses that qualify are the ones you would expect from long exposure to radioactive material and industrial poison. There is lung cancer, leukemia, bone cancer, and kidney disease on the qualifying list, along with chronic beryllium disease, from the same metal that reflected neutrons back into Slotin's plutonium sphere, which scars the lungs of people who breathe its dust, and silicosis from the construction trades. For a large share of claims, the government cannot reconstruct an individual worker's dose at all, because the monitoring records from the 1940s and 1950s either do not exist or were destroyed. So it applies a statistical model to the whole facility and pays out on the probability. That works out to about $134,000 per worker who filed. Set the two lists side by side. On one, there are 15 famous men, and 2 of them died of the work, while 13 died of the same things that killed their neighbors, at the same sorts of ages. On the other, there are 124,000 workers who mostly did not know what they were building, and who turned out decades later to be sick enough that Congress wrote a law specifically to pay them. The physicists at Los Alamos understood the risk they were running. Slotin understood it well enough to chalk a diagram on a blackboard while he was dying, so that 7 other men could be treated properly. That was informed consent, and it was his own hand on the screwdriver. The woman at the Calutron in Oak Ridge, watching a needle for 8 hours, was not offered that information. Neither was the man who welded pipe at Hanford. They were sold a payroll job in a town that did not officially exist, and the bill for it came due 30 and 40 and 50 years later in a claims office. Harry Daghlian's death is documented to the day, 25 days of it, in a hospital record at Los Alamos. That is what a nuclear program looks like when it kills someone in a way you can photograph. $16.6 billion is what it looks like when it kills people slowly enough that the accounting takes 80 years, and it is still open. Claims are still being filed against that program right now. Next time, the Nevada test site, and the specific 1953 decision to keep detonating during a wind shift towards St. George, Utah.